Good morning, and thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Amy Stewart, and I'll be your host for today. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Activating Growth Mindsets in the Classroom, Theory, Research, and Practice, with Mike Gershon, author of the Great Teaching Made Easy series, which includes his new book, How to Develop Growth Mindsets in the Classroom. Our webinar today is scheduled for about 45 minutes, and we'll have time for questions at the end. Before we start, I have a few helpful reminders for today's webinar. First, your audio lines are muted during the presentation. However, we welcome your questions and comments. You may do so at any point of the presentation using the GoToWebinar question pane located on your screen. Today's webinar will be recorded, and a link will be distributed to you via email. Feel free to share the presentation with your colleagues who are unable to attend. With that, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Mike Gershon is the best-selling author of more than 100 books and guides, and a teacher trainer providing educational consultancy and professional development. Gershon partners with schools, charities, and other organizations in the UK and Europe, focusing on topics including outstanding teaching, assessment for learning, differentiation, questioning, growth mindsets, and Bloom's taxonomy. Gershon is a graduate of York University and has a master's degree from the University of London and a postgraduate certificate in education from the Institute of Education. Without further delay, I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
That's super. Thank you so much, Amy. It's lovely to be here with you today. Well, wherever you are, I should say, in America. I'm currently in the United Kingdom, in York, and it's the afternoon here, but I'm sure it's morning over there. So good morning to you all, and thank you, Amy, for the introduction. So in today's session, we're going to be thinking about growth mindsets in the classroom. And my intention is in the first half of the session to provide you with some insight into the theory and research around growth mindsets, so to contextualize it really before we get on to the practice. Then in the second half of the session, we'll look at some practical techniques that any teacher can take, adapt and modify for use in their classroom to really encourage their learners to take on a growth mindset and to see themselves more positively, to be more resilient and to embrace challenges. So I'll have 2 or 3 polls as we go through, and that'll give you an opportunity just to reflect on your own experiences and to think about some of the learners that you work with already. And what I'll also say is that I'm not going to present to you as an absolute expert in every area of the curriculum today, far from it. But what I am going to do is present as an expert on teaching and learning, and specifically growth mindsets. So as we're going through, I think part of the webinar is for you to think about how you might take the ideas and adapt them for the particular areas of the curriculum that you work in, for the age groups you work with, and for your particular learners, because of course you're the expert in all these areas. So we're going to start with a question, ladies and gents, and it's this: how would you describe your brain? And you should see a poll coming up at the moment. Which of these 5 options would you go for? My brain is like a sponge. My brain is like a computer. My brain is like a tree. My brain is like fireworks. Or maybe my brain is like a filing cabinet. So see which one you go for. See which one feels most sort of appropriate to you at the moment. Now, the reason why I'm posing this question to you is because cognitive psychologists, and Carol Dweck, who is the progenitor of growth mindsets, is a cognitive psychologist. They're very much focused on how we think, on the way in which thinking influences our behavior, influences our thoughts and actions. So they examine the way in which we think about who we are, what we are, and what we believe is possible. So this question I've just posed to you here, whichever the answers you've gone for, if you were to share that description of your brain with a colleague or with a friend, they'd be able to understand it. And if you said my brain is like a sponge today, they'd know what you mean. Your brain is soaking up information just like a sponge can soak up information. Similarly, if you said, my brain today feels a bit more like a filing cabinet, they'd know what you meant. Stuff full of information. Maybe you've got to rifle through it in order to find things. So cognitive psychologists like Dweck believe that we make sense of who we are, how our minds work, and so on, through a sort of a series of beliefs that develop in us over time. Now, philosophers and psychologists alike would suggest that we have what is called a model of mind, and that is a model that over time, and perhaps subconsciously as well, we come to develop, and we use it to make sense of how our minds work. Now, we can communicate some of this to other people using the kind of language you've just looked at. My brain is like a sponge, or it's like a computer, or today it feels like a tree. But we can never have another person objectively experiencing what our mind is like. So what I'm saying to you is that we use language to both make sense of ourselves and our minds, and then to communicate that to other people. So let's take this all back down to growth mindsets. So Dweck, as a cognitive psychologist, is interested in thinking and how our thinking influences our behavior and our actions. So in terms of growth mindsets, Dweck is suggesting that we develop a model of mind, that our students develop a model of mind, and they use this to make sense of their experiences. And then that will influence how they talk about themselves, how they think about themselves, and how they do that both internally through their sort of internal monologue, but also externally when they're talking to you about it. So what we have here then is the growth mindset model of mind. This is the one that Dweck would suggest sort of most accurately describes the growth mindset perspective, and the one that we're really wanting our students to develop. Now, of course, some of our learners may already have this model of mind. This might be how they're thinking about themselves, about their learning, about their potential and so forth. But equally, we might have learners who aren't yet there. And actually what the situation there is, we really want to help them move from perhaps a sort of a more fixed mindset or more negative way of perceiving themselves to one which is more like this, the idea that your brain is like a muscle. So Dweck would argue that a learner with a growth mindset sees their brain, sees their mind as open to change. And by this, she means that they don't view what they've got as some kind of sort of fixed inheritance, sort of some, that all sort of intelligence, ability, talent, and so on is inherited. It's some kind of fixed entity within you. Instead, Dweck would argue, a learner with a growth mindset sees intelligence, talent, and ability as open to change. So the sort of simile, the metaphor which best describes that is this idea that the brain is like a muscle. And no learner is ever going to argue with you that muscles can change. Of course they can change, and they'll accept that as an objective fact. We know that if you train muscles, they will develop and they will grow. But a lot of learners will, argue against the idea that the brain can change, that the brain is like a muscle. But of course, we as teachers know that it very much can change. And that is the essence of learning. As somebody learns something, as they practice it, so that there are tangible changes in their brain which enables them to recall it and apply it later on, to make use of it and so forth. So what we're really trying to get across to learners with the idea of growth mindsets is that the most effective or the best way to think about your brain, yourself, your abilities is that it's like a muscle. It's open to change, and the more effort you put in, the more change you're going to be able to engender. So here we have a Carol Dweck herself, and Carol Dweck has been working in the field of cognitive psychology for many years, and she started really in the 1970s. And back then she was a graduate student, and she was deciding what she was going to study for her PhD. And she was interested in a couple of different things, and these two interests sort of came together and then underpinned a lot of her future research. The first key interest she had was, quite a big picture kind of interest, quite a global interest, one that we'd be familiar with, many of us would be familiar with. Why are some people successful? Is it that there is certain ways of thinking which cause people to be successful? And if there is a way of thinking, can we unpick that and can we then share it and let everybody know what it is? Now, the other thing that was of sort of particular interest to Dweck was something which was much more personal. And that was that she'd found throughout her sort of career as a student that she'd been very successful, but she'd also developed, she often felt at times a very significant fear of failure, that she was concerned that if she failed in her, in her tests or her essays or her exams, it would almost be like the world collapsing around her. And this didn't really tally with the truth of her experiences, because she had been very successful. She'd worked hard, and she'd succeeded academically on a consistent basis, to the point where she was now ready to do a PhD. So I suppose you might like to say that her rational self looked at her emotional self and said, why is this happening? And these are the two things which came together. So, an interest in her own experiences. Why do I have a fear of failure? Where does this come from? And an interest in this wider thing of, what causes success? Is it something to do with how you think? So Dweck started to build on existing work in psychology, and that existing work was called theories of intelligence, So this was work that had been conducted looking at how people make sense of intelligence, what they perceive it to be, what they think it is, how they think it functions. So that existing work posited that individuals tended to develop one of two theories of intelligence. The first theory is that the individual believes intelligence is an entity. So it's something that is inherited, it's something within you, just like your lungs are an entity or your heart is an entity, something which is just a part of you. The incremental theory of intelligence was the other model, and this is where the individual develops a theory over time where they believe that actually intelligence can change incrementally, and that change is driven by the choices you make as an individual. So you can see that Dweck was really building on, some established work in psychology. So over the next few decades, Dweck conducted a whole host of important studies looking at the influence of student self-perceptions in the classroom, looking at the impact of effort, of feedback, and perceptions of challenge and failure, and seeing how this played out and the kind of impact it had on learners' achievement and their resilience and so forth. And she eventually came to describe these two different theories of intelligence in terms that we're more familiar with today. So the entity theory of intelligence became the fixed mindset, and the incremental theory of intelligence became the growth mindset. So what Dweck is arguing is that the learners that we work with tend to have fundamental beliefs about themselves connected to their view of intelligence, talent, and ability. They might have a growth mindset in relation to all areas of learning. They might have a fixed mindset in relation to all areas. Or, as is often the case, they might have a mixture of the two. So, for example, you might have a learner who goes into a math lesson, and as soon as they go in that lesson, they believe that they cannot get better at maths. They think that, there's a math gene out there and they don't have it. And as a result of that, they almost put up a barrier straight away, and they find it very difficult to embrace challenges and so forth. But that same learner might then go into an English lesson or language or a literature lesson and just fundamentally believe that actually anyone can get better at English, whether it's language or literature, and the harder you work, the better you're going to get. So you often see this situation where learners have a growth mindset in one area, a fixed mindset in another area. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of sort of famous individuals who very much exemplify the growth mindset. The first one being Michael Jordan, who I'm sure we'll all know as one of the greatest basketball players of all time. And this comes from a Nike advert in the 1990s when Jordan was asked to sum up the success that he'd had in his career. And this is what he said: I've missed more than 9,000 shots. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and miss. I've failed over and over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed. So Michael Jordan really demonstrated to us here the growth mindset attitude. We can read into this and say it's almost certainly the case that Jordan perceives his ability, his talent, his intelligence as open to change. And the more effort he puts in, the harder he works, the more that change is going to come. Because of course, the only reason he was trusted to take the game-winning shot 26 times and missed is because after he missed the first time, he didn't give up. He didn't say, no, that's it, put the wall up, I don't want to experience that again. Instead, he probably said, okay, why did I miss it? What can I do to try and avoid missing it next time? And of course, he doesn't tell us how many times he took the game-winning shot and scored, but I'd imagine it would be many, many more times. Similarly, he says, I've failed over and over and over again in my life, but that is why I succeed. Well, once more, we see the resilience embedded in the growth mindset here. You can only keep failing if you keep trying. And I think we would say that Jordan most probably sees those failures as important, events that help him to develop, to get better. Because it's through failure, it's through trial and improvement that we, work out what we can't do yet, what we need to improve, and how we can improve it. So just one other example coming from a very different area of life, but also, exemplifying that growth mindset perspective. Here we have Samuel Beckett, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 1950s. Beckett was an Irish playwright who wrote in French and English, and his most famous work is possibly Waiting for Godot, a famous play. Now, Beckett was very interested in the idea of failure, and it animated much of his work. And this quote, which you might be familiar with, comes from one of his lesser-known works called Worsted Hoe. And it's in the voice of one of the characters. Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. So Beckett here is inverting the notion of failure. And he's implying, I would suggest, that we can all imagine perfection in our minds. We can all sit there and think, what would perfection look like? Wouldn't it be wonderful when I got everything right, when I, got a top mark on my essay, or I did brilliantly in this piece of work? But Beckett's saying, actually, the real world isn't like that. The real world is messy. We get things wrong. We try again. So he's saying, look at failure in a different way. See failure as actually just a normal consequence of trying, of putting your effort in, and of learning. So once again, illustrating this growth mindset idea that we are open to change, that change is linked to the effort we make and the choices we make. So we can now see these two key different ways of thinking in their sort of most concise form. So this is the crux of Dweck's research. These are the two mindsets that she identifies building on that initial work in cognitive psychology. On the one hand, we have the fixed mindset. The individual, the student, believes that intelligence and the talent are fixed at birth, that they can't change. Therefore, the learner is far more likely to be passive, because they're essentially starting from a position where they believe that, what they've got is what they've got, and it doesn't matter what they do, that isn't going to change. Now, on the other side, we have the growth mindset. And the starting premise here is that intelligence and talent can go up or down. So here we're far more likely to have a learner who is active, who has a sense of agency, who believes that they are the key player in their learning, that the choices they make, the decisions they take are highly influential in what happens. So for example, I'm going to use an English sporting example here. David Beckham, famous footballer who, is now actually based over in America, and I'm sure you'll have heard of him. David Beckham, when he was a footballer or a soccer player, perhaps I should say, when he was a young soccer player, he was by no means the best player, not at all. In fact, many of his peers were better than him. However, he very much had a growth mindset, and he believed that he could maximize his talent by working exceptionally hard, working harder than his peers. So he would do extra training sessions, he would stay later than everybody else. And gradually over time, his talent increased. He made the most of it. But there were some of his peers who had a fixed mindset, who'd been told again and again, you're the best, you're fantastic, you're absolutely awesome at soccer. They didn't work, they didn't try hard. So relative to David Beckham, their talent actually went down. It plateaued, it stayed where it was, whereas his improved. So what we see here is the fundamental principle that Dweck and cognitive psychologists are putting forward is that the beliefs we have influence our behaviors. And we've got a famous quote here, which which puts this to us very concisely. It comes from Henry Ford, of course, the creator of the Model T Ford, founder of the Ford Motor Company. But it was said before him by Dryden, and even further back by Virgil in ancient Rome. Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. Now, that is taking it down to, perhaps too simplistic, but we really capture there in Ford's quote what we're getting at. This idea that if you start from a core belief, you're then going to make decisions based on that belief. And we can see that, most sort of helpfully exemplified in this table here. This table shows us the link that Dweck picks out between the key beliefs, those mindsets, and the actions which are likely to follow from them. So let me just talk you through each side here. And I should emphasize at this point, have a look at the third box down. It does say a tendency, okay? So we're not saying that these mindsets lead absolutely to these different behaviors. What we're saying is the mindsets lead to a tendency for these behaviors to arise. So fixed mindset, intelligence is static. It's more likely that a child who is operating with that point of view is going to avoid challenges because, challenges are a threat. It might show up what they can't do. They're more likely to give up easily due to obstacles because they see obstacles as something which actually they're not going to be able to get round. Effort becomes fruitless because they think, well, actually, I can't get any better than what I already am, so what's the point in trying? And feedback becomes threatening instead of being useful because they see feedback as a sort of identification of what they lack rather than something from which they can learn. Other people's success becomes threatening because they see everybody as having, a fixed amount of intelligence. So if someone else is successful, it bumps you down the pecking order. Okay, so we'll get a poll up here and have a think about those 5 different characteristics, those key characteristics there that come from the fixed mindset. which do you feel are most common for your learners? Which do you see in your learners on a most regular basis? One that, often, well, no, I won't say because I don't want to prejudice you. You decide which one comes up. But while you're having a think about that, let me just talk you through the growth mindset side so we can see that contrast here. So if the learner starts off from a premise that intelligence can be developed, they're far more likely to embrace challenges because they can predict positively into the future. And that's a key difference here. A child with a growth mindset, it finds it far easier in general to make positive predictions about the future. They can imagine themselves getting over a challenge. They can imagine themselves conquering a challenge. A child with a fixed mindset finds that much more difficult to do. So therefore, a child with a growth mindset, more likely to embrace challenge. They're also more likely to persist in spite of obstacles because, they can imagine what it will be like to get round them. And they also have this fundamental belief that actually their choices, the decisions they make, influence what happens next. So the obstacles are something they can overcome rather than almost, sort of like a giant mountain blocking their path. They're also more likely to see effort as a path to mastery because they have this sense of agency, this belief that their choices, their efforts, their endeavors can lead to change. So, effort for them becomes something useful, something which can actually cause them to learn, to grow, and to do better. And you see very much here, just calling back, you see very much here this idea, that model of mind, that the brain is like a muscle. The effort you put in is what causes it to change and to grow. Learners with a growth mindset also more likely to learn from criticism. It doesn't mean they love criticism. Yeah, it doesn't mean that they say, "Oh, sir, miss, tell me more things that I've done wrong. Give me a bigger list of things I need to change." But it does mean they can separate out, that emotional response they might have and say, "Okay, right, put that to one side. Right, what can I get from this criticism? How can I use it?" And in fact, you see many learners with a growth mindset actively seeking criticism and feedback. They'll actively go to the teacher and say, "Miss, sir, can you give me some more feedback? Can you give me some advice on this?" An example from my own experience would be, those learners who come to you after the lesson and say, "Sir, can you just give me 10 minutes of your time at break or at lunch? I really want to talk this through with you and get more, some more advice from you." They're taking control there of their learning. They're really taking control and being active about it. And then the final one, they're more likely to be inspired by other people's success because they look at that success and say, actually, that's proof that you can develop, you can change, and I can do that as well. So overall, then, what we have here, ladies and gents, is the two core beliefs, the sort of starting principles, as it were, the fixed mindset, the growth mindset. Intelligence is static, intelligence can be developed. But these lead to a series of different consequences. So you have the fixed mindset, intelligence is static, making it more likely that these, what we might describe as more negative behaviors that certainly don't help the child with their learning or with their experience of learning, they're more likely to come about, to arise. And then on the other side, if you're starting off from that growth mindset premise, it's likely to give rise to a whole series of different behaviors. So what we're very much trying to do in the classroom, I would argue, is encourage this growth mindset. So we encourage these positive behaviors, and it tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because as we all know as teachers, we can look at those bullet points there on the growth mindset side and we can say, if learners are doing that, they're more likely to enjoy learning and they're more likely to be successful as well. So what I want to do now, ladies and gents, with that sort of theory laid out, is in the second half of the session, look at some practical strategies that we can employ to really help learners to develop a growth mindset or to reinforce an existing growth mindset. So I'm just going to skip a couple of slides here, but they are available afterwards if you want to look in more detail. Now, perhaps the best way we can start, but one of the best practical strategies we can begin with to really encourage students to develop a growth mindset is to look at case studies. The reason case studies are so powerful is because they provide learners with a narrative, with a story, which they can grab hold of, they can assimilate, they can understand. So it takes this abstract idea, presents it in a very concrete and a very memorable form. And I just want to share with you 3 examples here to illustrate this. And as we're doing so, think about how your learners might respond if you were going to share them with them. So first up here, ladies and gents, we have a very famous figure, Thomas Edison. Not the inventor of the light bulb. I must say, that was invented in the United Kingdom, but the inventor of the mass-produced filament light bulb, the one that we, used for such a long period of time and brought light, of course, to millions of homes, not just across America, but throughout the world. Now, Edison, often presented in popular culture as a lone genius. We know him as a great inventor, and often inventors is sort of shown in films and so on as, sort of working on their own and suddenly having these flashes of inspiration. But of course, this actually is very much not the case. The true story of Edison is that he went through 10,000 failures before they finalized the design of the mass manufactured filament light bulb. Not only that, he was employing 30 full-time career scientists. He had an army of lab technicians, and he had corporate funding. And they were all working around the clock, doing sort of 3 8-hour shifts a day in the factory, in the facilities that they had, to really successfully find a way to make the light bulb work. So what we've got here is a case study illustrating the reality of how success happens, of how we achieve goals, of how we learn and we develop. Thomas Edison going through failure after failure, going through an extended period of trial and improvement, working with others, getting feedback, using that feedback to make changes, and only as a result of that, finding success at the end of it all. Here's a second example, more recent. Now, you might not be familiar with this gentleman, I'm not sure. This is James Dyson, and he is a UK inventor. And you can see in the background there's vacuum cleaner. James Dyson invented the bagless vacuum cleaner. And I'm sure Dysons will be available across the States, and you may well have them yourself. Back in the late 1970s, James Dyson was working as a vacuum cleaner cleaner engineer in the United Kingdom. And he had the idea that he could create a bagless vacuum cleaner. So he quit his job and he started work on this at home. He remortgaged his house, took out a lot of funding, and he went through over 5,000 prototypes before he had a bagless vacuum cleaner that would work, that would function successfully, that people could use to clean their homes. So of course he was delighted. Then he tried to get this vacuum cleaner mass manufactured, distributed, and sold. Unfortunately, in the early 1980s, all the vacuum cleaner companies that he took this to rejected his idea. And the reason was they were making more money from selling vacuum cleaner bags than from selling vacuum cleaners. So the last thing they wanted was a bagless vacuum cleaner. So Dyson then had to go to Japan and get the bagless vacuum cleaner manufactured out there. And he then had to sort of develop the brand, and he had to develop the company from scratch. And here we are sort of over 30 years later, and he's actually one of the largest private companies in the UK with a turnover in excess of £4 billion. But once again, what we've got here is a case study demonstrating that success is all about persistence. It's all about that resilience. It's all about saying, actually, the challenge is to pick yourself up, to try again, to look at why it didn't work, and to say, okay, what can I learn from it? How can I change things? How can I do that differently next time? Here's our third and final case study. And I wonder if you recognize this picture, who it might be. This is a picture of the lady when she was 12 years old, when she was a girl. And I can reveal to you, ladies and gents, it's actually a picture of Taylor Swift, the famous pop singer. And Taylor Swift tweeted this picture to her followers, so I'm told, because she was very sort of concerned, very worried that a lot of her young fans were comparing themselves to her unfavorably. And she said, look, this is me when I was 12. I was a normal 12-year-old, looked like anybody else. Just enjoy the music, don't sort of compare yourself. Don't develop that negative self-image. So a really nice message. But Taylor Swift gives us another great example of a case study, because when she was around about 14 years old, she asked her dad if the whole family could move to Nashville, Tennessee, so that she could pursue her dream of becoming, a famous country musician. So by that point, she'd already been playing music for a number of years. She was already, had sort of 5-6 years of practice behind her. Now, her dad worked for Bank of America Merrill Lynch, and he was able to get a transfer to the Nashville office. So the whole family moved down to Nashville. And Taylor Swift then spent the next sort of roughly 5 or 6 years playing gigs in Nashville, working with singer-songwriters, pursuing this dream, essentially, putting in concerted effort, sustained effort over an extended period, learning from people with high levels of skill, getting feedback, improving. And then when she was round about sort of 20 years old, she started to release some albums. And, what we don't remember today is that actually her first few albums weren't hugely successful. It was only when she sort of changed her style to a bit more of a pop country style that she started to get success. And then, of course, after that, things skyrocketed. And as we know today, she's one of the most successful music artists in the world. But again, what we're demonstrating to learners is actually, they might see the end result of success. They might see Taylor Swift on MTV or on Instagram or wherever, or listen to her music. But actually, there's nearly always behind the success, there's always a story of effort, of persistence, of practice, of keeping going, of learning from your mistakes. So we use these case studies to really demonstrate this to our learners, to help them understand the reality of what learning is like, of what life is like. So they have that growth mindset, as opposed to that fixed mindset, which just assumes, oh, some people are born geniuses. Thomas Edison was born a genius. Taylor Swift was born a genius musician. It just comes to them naturally. No, what we're saying is actually, yes, you might have some people who are born with, certain sort of inherited characteristics that give them an advantage in one area. But actually, it doesn't matter who you are. You've got to work. You've got to put that effort in. You've got to have that persistence. Now, of course, ladies and gents, you don't have to use famous case studies. I've used those because I knew they would be familiar to you. They were good examples that we could all sort of get on board with. But of course, you can use local and personal case studies. Those can be really powerful as well. So, for example, you can ask a learner who you worked with a couple of years ago and who really sort of changed and developed and grew. You can ask them to come back and talk to your class, your current class, about that journey, about what happened, about how they tried, how they failed, how they kept going. Or you can talk about some of your own experiences. You can use yourself as a case study to illustrate to learners, the importance of that growth mindset, attitude of persistence, and so forth. So that's my first strategy for you, ladies and gents. Growth mindset case studies, both famous examples, as we've seen here, Edison, Dyson, Taylor Swift, but also those local and personal ones as well. Now, my second strategy for you is about giving students growth mindset language. And we're going to get another poll up here as well, something for you to think about. So what I'm suggesting to you, ladies and gents, is that actually learners need language that they can use to talk about growth mindsets, to talk in a growth mindset way, to talk about their experiences, to make sense of those experiences in a growth mindset way, from the sort of growth mindset perspective. So you see here, we've got a range of different growth mindset phrases in the poll. Which ones do you think your learners would most grab onto? Which ones do you think would have the biggest impact if you were to use them? Now, I've also put on the screen, a range of different words here that you can use. And for me, I think there's two very effective ways through which you can approach this. The first one is taking it from a big picture perspective. The second one is taking it from a sort of individual perspective. The big picture perspective is you say, okay, as a school, we're going to focus on growth mindsets, and we're going to give students that sort of consistent linguistic experience across the school of the kind of language that we want to model, which we want them to then use, so they're thinking in that growth mindset way. So if you're doing that, you say, okay, as a school, which maybe 5 words are we going to pick out that really sort of give voice to what we believe as a school, learning is all about, and that students should be focusing on. So you make those words, you select those words, you agree them as a school, and then you share them with learners, and then you persist with those words over an extended period of time, using them on a regular basis, using them both in written and in verbal language, so giving them currency in the school so that learners have that language modeled. They can then internalize it. They can start using it to give voice to their own experiences, to make sense of those experiences from a growth mindset perspective. Of course, it can be very powerful if you involve learners in that choice. Give you an example, a school I worked with in North London, what they did there was they agreed as a whole school, learners and teachers, what were the key growth mindset words going to be that they thought were most important and had the greatest value. They took those words, put them into a word cloud. That became the school, a replacement for the school motto, and it was then visible in every classroom, and learners and teachers were encouraged to use it on a regular basis to talk about learning, to talk about their experiences, and so forth. So the second approach is where you say, actually, okay, I'm just going to focus on this on a classroom level. What are the words that really work for me? What is the growth mindset language that really tallies with how I approach teaching and, what I want my learners to feel and experience when they're in the classroom. Now, of course, the advantage with that method is that you can select words and phrases that really sit nicely with your own view, and with your own style of teaching. So, for example, when I was teaching, I really like to talk about good mistakes, it's like mistakes as being brilliant, as mistakes being fantastic opportunities for learning. That was a route that I really liked to go down, and then really encouraging students as a result to see mistakes not as a problem, not as something to avoid, but actually something that all of us in the class were actively seeking out. And the idea being that actually, if you're making some mistakes, the level of challenge is probably about right. So this second strategy to you then, ladies and gents, to sum up, what I'm suggesting is this: learners need language that they can use to talk about growth mindsets, to talk about and give voice to their own experiences. And don't forget that many learners won't have necessarily heard this language at home. They might not have heard it in their earlier school career as well. So what we're doing is here, we're offering an alternative, a growth mindset language or framework for talking about growth mindsets, giving that currency so that learners internalize it and then can talk about it both in their internal monologues and externally with us and with their peers. Okay, I'm going to move things on, ladies and gents, because I want to give you a range of different techniques you can use. Here's the next one. It's a great little tool. You've got it on the slides, but if you Google which step have you reached today, you should be able to find a copy on Google Images nice and easy. This is a fantastic tool for reframing how learners think about their learning. Okay, it's a really good technique you can use to focus learners in on the process and as a result to get them thinking in a growth mindset way. So what you'll see here is that we've got a series of steps and they're delineated, and each step becomes progressively more positive, sort of progressively more engaged with the learning. What it provides us with is a way to say to learners, when you're at the bottom and you feel like you won't do it or you feel like you can't do it, instead of saying, let's make a huge leap to being able to do it, we say, actually, let's look at the next step. Let's break it down and focus on the process, and then we'll do it bit by bit. We'll put a bit of effort into the next step, then into the next step, then into the one after. Because what we often find in the classroom is you get a learner who's at that point in time operating with a fixed mindset, and they don't believe they can do something. They see their peers around them being able to do it, so that they can imagine what it would be like to do the thing in question, but at that point in time they fundamentally don't believe they'll be able to do it. So we present them with the steps, with the reframing, and we say, okay, I understand that's how you feel at the moment. We don't deny their voice, because actually all of us want our voice to be heard. So we don't deny their voice. We say, okay, I understand that, but what I'm saying is, you're here at the moment, you're on the second step or the first step. What can we do to get up to the next step? And suddenly you and the learner have this language that you can use to talk about the process, to talk about that, that sticky, that difficult, that muddy bit of learning, the middle bit, which is actually, as we know, the most important bit. So to give you one example, a way I've seen this used really well, teachers print off a copy, laminate it, and then they set their learners off on an activity, and they walk around the classroom with the laminated steps. They pop it down on the table and they say to their learners, okay, where are you at the moment? How are you feeling about it? And suddenly there's just that really easy, simple, effective way to talk about the process of learning, to take the attention away from the performance, away from the end goal. Can I do it? Can I not do it? And instead say, what do we need to do next? Where do we need to go next with this? Now, of course, you can use it as it is, or you can come up with your own version, and you can put your own questions or statements in the steps. But however you do it, however you use it, you're helping to refocus learners on the process, and as a result, get them thinking that growth mindset way, which says, actually, effort matters, effort can make a difference. The learning is what is important rather than the end product, the end goal. Now, we've got another example of this here, ladies and gents, and this comes from a school in Oxfordshire in the UK. Well, not the idea itself, the image. The idea itself comes from a gentleman called James Nottingham, but I think we can sort of trace the wider idea back, as far as Plato, we might say, and ancient Greece. Now, the idea here is another way of just reframing that learning journey. So we say, okay, every time we start a new topic, all of us, we fall into the pit. And the pit is that sort of experience of difficulty, of not being able to do things. And then the learning journey is actually about climbing out of that pit, and is finding ways through practice, through repetition, through making mistakes, through trial and improvement, is finding a way to learn, to develop, to grow, to get to that high level of understanding. So this is just a different way that we can reframe, same principle as the steps, but again, what it does is it focuses learners onto the process, and it helps them to break that process down and see it as a series of steps, so it becomes much more manageable, and they can develop, they can then have that growth mindset attitude. And instead of thinking, I can't do it, I'll never be able to do it, they think, I can't do it yet, what do I need to do next? So once again, it gives you and the learners that bit of language that you can use to talk about the process and to talk about some of those experiences there. So one example of where I've seen this used really nicely in an English school, a teacher working with young learners here, so learners who are about 8 or 9 years old, and at the start of a new topic, they all get together at the front of the room and they make a circle, and the teacher says, okay, we're going to jump into the pit all together. So they join hands, 1, 2, 3, jump. And they all take a jump forwards, and they've all jumped into the pit. The idea being that they've all sort of taken that leap, taken that challenge together themselves, and then the next step, the learning journey, is to find ways to get out of that pit, so they develop their understanding. Okay, ladies and gents, we're coming pretty close to 45 minutes, so I'm just gonna get through a couple more before we finish, a couple more practical strategies. There are a few more on the slides as well that you can have a look at in your own time. This next technique is called mental contrasting, and it comes from a Dutch psychologist called Gabriel Oettingen. And Oettingen was interested in looking at if there are certain ways that we frame our goals that make us more likely to achieve those goals, more likely to persist with them. And Oettingen's research suggests that yes, actually, there is a way we can frame our goals that leads us to be more successful. And she describes it as mental contrasting, where we contrast what we want to achieve with the steps we need to take to achieve it. And you see this exemplified on the screen here in 3 different cases. So if I want to play the piano, then I will need to practice regularly. That is the form that a mental contrast takes, an if-then statement. Now, Oettingen is saying here that what we're doing is we're taking our goal and we're very clearly connecting it to the process, to the steps, to the effort we'll need to put in to achieve it. And you see here how it promotes that growth mindset, because it says to the learner, okay, what do you want to achieve? Fantastic. That's the motivation. That's what you're setting out to really try and succeed with. Connect that to the things you'll need to do. Connect that to what you will need to take an active role in doing. Connect that to your own agency. So what Oettingen found through her research is that when we phrase our goals in this manner and then state those publicly, either to our peer, our friend, or a colleague, or whoever, or to our teacher, we're more likely to persist with them. Because in our minds, we're drawing that connection between what we want to achieve, what we're motivated to achieve, and the process we need to go through in order to achieve it. So a couple of ways you can use this in the classroom. One is if you give students targets, you then say to your students, okay, let's if-then our targets. So then the learner takes their target, and it could be something like, to include at least 2 examples every time they make a new point in an essay. That might be their target. The student takes that and puts it in an if-then sentence. And suddenly they've just rephrased that target. They've taken some ownership of it, and they have a connection in their mind between the achievement of the target and the active steps they need to take to make it happen. Another way that you can do it is if you have learning objectives, for your lesson as a whole, saying what you hope to achieve, you can have them in an if-then statement. So you say, if we all want to be better essay writers by the end of this lesson, then we are going to focus on including key pieces of evidence in our writing. So again, what you're doing is you're just finding another way to, in learners' minds, make that connection between the goal, between what we're trying to achieve, and the process. And what we find is that learners with a growth mindset are far more focused on the process, on the learning, whereas learners with a fixed mindset far more focused on the end goal, on the performance, on the achievement. And there's a famous coach of the San Francisco 49ers. His name's escaped me for a moment, but his famous phrase was, "The score takes care of itself." If you focus on the process and you get the process right, the score or the end result or the performance, that will take care of itself. And that's the message we're trying to send to our learners. It might be a high achieving learner who could perhaps get a fixed mindset because they feel they always must achieve a high grade. Could be a lower achieving learner who has a fixed mindset and believes that they'll never be able to achieve a high grade. In both cases, we say, hey, Don't focus on the performance. Don't focus on the end goal. Instead, focus on the process, focus on the learning, focus on the steps, focus on what you control, on the effort you can put in, and the changes that that can give rise to. Now, ladies and gents, we're almost finished for questions, but I'm just going to show you one final slide very quickly, which is just a really important one. And Dweck identified in some of her key research the importance of avoiding trait-based praise. So what you see here on your screen is on the left, we've got some statements. Statements 1, 2, and 4 are very much positive praise. Statements 3 and 5 could be seen as slightly more negative praise. What Dweck says is if students hear these kind of statements again and again, it can very much reinforce the idea of a growth mindset. Because if students hear those positive messages, that's great, super work, you're a genius, and that's all they hear, they may well just start to believe they're successful because there's something about them that makes them successful. Similarly, if a learner, we would never do this, but they might hear it in other contexts. If they only ever hear, it's wrong or you don't get it, they might just start to assume that actually they're just someone who gets things wrong or who doesn't get things. So what Dweck says instead is we should avoid these sort of statements that imply fixed traits and instead try and phrase our praise so it includes references, to what learners have done. So it's almost more sort of like praise in the form of feedback. So you can see that first one there, that's great. Well, we still want to say that's great. We still want to give the learner that positive message, but we then tie it to the reason why it's great. That's great because you went through 3 attempts first before settling on the one which works best. And then the message to the learner is actually they've been successful because of the things they've done, because of the choices they made, not because there's something inherent to them which causes them to be successful, but because of the choices they've made. Similarly, we might have something like number 3 there, it's wrong. Well, if it's wrong is the end of the conversation, that's a problem. But if it's the start of the conversation, fantastic. Because then we're saying, well, everybody gets things wrong. Actually, that's interesting. What can we learn from it? How can we look at what happened and look at the process and see what we can change next time? So my final strategy for you there, ladies and gents, reframing away from trait-based praise, making sure learners have a clear understanding of why we're saying the things we're saying to them, why we're giving them praise. As I said, there are some more ideas on the slides. You can look at them in your own time, but I don't want to talk for any longer on this, ladies and gents. And excuse me while I skip forward. Because we are going to move on to questions. So I'll throw it over now. We've got Amy and Maya helping us out, and thank you so much to them. They've been dealing with and fielding the questions. So they're going to put some of those forwards, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Mike. At this time, we'd like to hand it over to our audience and address any questions you may have for our presenter. As a reminder, you can submit questions using the question pane on your screen. And with that, I'll ask the first question, Mike. Developing a growth mindset also happens at home. Do you have any strategies teachers can pass on to parents to use at home to help their child start building a growth mindset?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's absolutely right. And whenever I work with schools in the United Kingdom and in Europe, I always say to them, it's absolutely imperative that you get parents involved. So I think there are a couple of things you can do. The first one is to have a training session or an information evening in school for parents. So you get parents in and you just 45 minutes or an hour, giving them a session on growth mindsets, explaining to them what growth mindsets are and helping them to understand what the research tells us and also some of the key language that we can be using and some of the key language to avoid. I think that's the first step. The second step, I think, is remembering that nearly all parents want to do the best for their children, but they're not experts in teaching and education like we are as teachers. So we can then provide them with some access to our expertise. So for example, it might be that we send home some little, language cheat sheets. So just like that, reframing away from trait-based praise we saw there, we could do something like that and send a copy home to parents and say, okay, we know that you're really proud of your children. And, there can be a real incentive at times to want to tell them they're a genius and they're smart and they're clever. But instead of saying that, why not give them praise which tells them why they've done well, which tells them why they're being successful. So that can be really helpful as well. I think the other thing as well is, when children and parents come in for parents' evening, when they come in to talk to teachers at school, it's consistently sending that message to parents and saying, what we really want our students and our children to be focusing on is that process of learning. We want them to be thinking about what happened, how did it work, why wasn't it successful, what could I do next time? And encouraging the parents to have less of a focus on the end product and more of a focus on the process as well.
Great, thanks, Mike. Next question, is it too late to start doing this with high school students?
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. And, I'd say absolutely not. I think, one thing we do find from, working with schools, it's perhaps sometimes easier to get it going with elementary school students, but it's absolutely not. And in fact, a point Dweck makes in her books and in her research is that actually you can change your mindset however old you are. These things aren't fixed perpetually. They are just beliefs that, they're important, powerful beliefs, but they're always open to change. And I've worked with many high schools, or as we would call them, secondary schools in the United Kingdom, where, through sort of a consistent focus on growth mindset language and ideas and strategies, they've really helped their secondary school, their high school learners change their attitude towards learning. I think one of the things when you're working with older learners is actually you get more of an opportunity to bring them into it and sort of play a critical role, because with them, having sort of greater cognitive development due to their increased maturity, you can get them to engage with the ideas at a more abstract level than we do with some of our younger learners. I think perhaps one of the most important things, though, when we're working with high school learners, is to you know really reinforce that sense to them that whatever their experiences are in the past, whether they've had experiences of failure or success or whatever, those experiences are not determiners of the future experiences that they can have. And I think that's a really powerful message, to get across to those learners, because, for example, you're going to have high school learners who might have had repeated experiences of failure through their career as a learner, and as a result, may really feel that they just can't do learning, or learning's not for them. And what we're saying to them with growth mindsets is actually, the future isn't yet written, but the way you think about yourself has an impact on the choices you make and therefore the future which arises. So if you can change your thinking, then you're likely to make different choices, and that can change the future outcomes. And just sort of allied to that as well, another thing I think can be really powerful with some older learners is helping them to understand that failure isn't a mark of who you are. It's not a sign of what you lack, or of who you are as a person. As we saw with, Michael Jordan very early on in the presentation, failure is actually it's just an event in life. It's something that happens to all of us. When you fail in the classroom, when you fail, when you're learning to drive or wherever, it's just an event, and it passes on, and we can choose to learn from it, or we can choose to ignore it. And I think, some older learners, if they have experienced failure on a regular basis, or if they've never experienced it, and therefore have a high fear of it, they can feel that failure is somehow indicative of who they are and of what they lack. And we're saying, no, that's not the case. And, that can be a very powerful way, I think, to help them get on board with growth mindsets at an older age.
All right, great. Got quite a few coming in here, so we'll just keep moving through them. Do
Sure.
you have any suggestions about how to create a growth mindset culture in a school to get teachers on board who might have a fixed mindset without these teachers feeling threatened or being exposed or resisting and hindering the process?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And of course, when you are working with growth mindsets, it does cause you, to reflect on yourself and say, how do I perceive myself? And how do those perceptions influence my behavior? And as I said earlier on, many of us will have a mixture. And, I include myself in that. Even now there'll be things that I'll do in life, whether it be work or leisure or something else, and I'll sometimes catch myself and think, actually, that's a fixed mindset view you're taking. Consider how you're thinking about it. So yes, it's important, and of course we don't want to label teachers, we don't want to label colleagues or anything like that. So I think when you're introducing it, it's good to start off with all the staff together and give people an opportunity to reflect on their own experiences of school and their own experiences of learning. So essentially what you're doing there is you're giving them an opportunity to reflect in a very safe way on situations where actually they might have either had a fixed mindset, or a fixed mindset might have been implied to them, perhaps through teachers they had when they were younger, or messages they received as a child. So I think that's the first starting point there, where you're really then helping your colleagues to sort of get into these ideas. I think the next step is then as well to, perhaps provide some scenarios in that training to colleagues and say, okay, imagine there was a teacher in this position, and imagine this teacher before the start of every lesson with, class 9G or whatever, thought to themselves, oh, not that lot again. I know what they're like, or words to that effect. So you provide some scenarios so the teachers can actually think through the consequences of having a fixed mindset, the consequences on their learners without having to necessarily make that very personal connection. So essentially just distancing them from it slightly. And I think that's a good way to get them then to start actually thinking critically, well, hang on, how often do I do that? Am I guilty of that without realizing?
Great, thanks. Next question. Should equity issues be addressed when talking to students about growth mindsets? I'm thinking about students who lag behind their peers because they've had different home experiences that haven't given them a head start on learning.
Yeah, so I think what we're not saying with growth mindsets, we're not saying that everyone can achieve everything at the same time, because of course it's going to depend on your prior schooling experience, and as the questioner quite rightly says, prior home experience and so on. I think growth mindset is making a much weaker claim, but a more powerful one as a result. It's saying everyone is open to change, and everyone can change, learn, grow, and develop from that wherever their starting point is at that point in time. And it's then easier to make that change, to learn and to develop, and probably more enjoyable if you begin from the belief that you can. So yeah, it's quite. I would never be keen on sort of ignoring, differences at that point in time, or and you wouldn't say to learners, oh, everyone could be the next Beethoven, nothing, like that. What we're saying is, wherever you are at now, actually you have within you your brain and the ability to put in effort. You have within you the tools you need to learn and to be more successful, to grow and develop. And if you start by believing that, it's gonna be easier for you to make choices and make decisions and to respond to things that happen in the classroom in a way that helps you rather than hinders you.
Thank you. What strategies do you have for teachers who work with at-risk students who have a history of negative school experiences, mostly for high school and middle school students?
Okay, yeah. So of course, this is a group who have very sort of distinct needs, and I think one of the most important things often with learners in those situations is obviously to build rapport with them as we would do with any learners, but to make it clear to them that this is a safe space and that you're there very much as their support, and on hand for that. I think then it's also really important to give them opportunities to be successful. And I think things like the reframing we saw earlier on and breaking down that process so it becomes a series of perhaps small steps initially that learners can do and achieve success, not so that they feel like, oh, I can do everything, but so that they see that taking that approach and breaking down these larger goals, these things that can feel very big and very difficult for them, breaking it down into that series of small steps makes it much more manageable. I think the other thing with those learners is to sort of really try and find some of the key things that motivate them already, because whilst many learners will perhaps not have motivation directly linked to the subjects we're doing in school, every learner has motivation somewhere, something that interests them, and then helping them to think about how their view of themselves when they're in that area of their life influences their decisions and behavior, and then saying to them, okay, well, can we take a little bit of that view and bring it into the classroom, and what might that look like, and how can we make that connection, and could we even say, okay, we're going to put that hat on when we're in the classroom in this particular period. So I suppose it's essentially saying, can we take something where the learner has that existing motivation in their wider life and then help them to bring that into the classroom, almost to sort of translate it across, so it gives them a route in to that growth mindset way of thinking, despite those negative experiences they might have had in the past.
Great, thanks, Mike. Next question. Does adapting the contents of the learning to the student's interest help shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset?
I think it can do. It can do. If the learner is significantly demotivated, therefore, we modify the content so it plays to their motivations. Then, clearly, I think that's going to make it easier for the learner to engage and potentially more likely for them to take that growth mindset perspective and believe that they can change and that it's worth putting in effort and so forth. I suppose over the longer term, we're trying to cultivate a situation where learners have that growth mindset to sort of learning in general, and are then even in a position where even if they don't find a topic particularly interesting, they can still sort of put that to one side and say, well, nonetheless, if I put effort into this, I can improve. But yeah, it's always good to connect to learners motivations and their personal interests and so on, just as we as adults and professionals find the same thing, when content is sort of tailored to our interests as well.
Perfect. All right, next question. I have a tendency to praise students for getting the right answers and for getting them quickly. Is this encouraging a fixed mindset in my students who didn't get the answers as quickly? In other words, should I stop praising my high-performing students?
Well, I think that, potentially it could. I couldn't say for certain without, knowing the context more specifically. But I think what we want to try and avoid here is if you've got some high ability students who are consistently getting everything right very quickly, and we're giving them praise again and again and again, two things might happen. First thing is that learner might just assume they get things right because they're high ability, but actually they might be getting those things right because they put in practice in the past because they've already mastered that content. Then other learners in the class might start to assume that you're only going to receive praise if you get it right automatically. So an alternative route might be to praise the learners, but as I said earlier, connect that to why they've been successful. And also, another one could be to say, oh, maybe I need to give you a more challenging question, because if you're getting everything right so quickly, maybe me as the teacher, I need to increase the level of challenge. That can be a route to go down as well with that, I think.
Great, and yeah, on that note, I'll finish it off with a comment we received from an audience member. I read your book and decided to try out the challenge wall. My students loved it and it kept my high-performing students busy. Do you want to close off the webinar with one more strategy and talk more about implementing a challenge wall in a classroom?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, so I mean, a challenge wall, there's a number of ways you can approach this, but I'll just give one as an example. So this is where you have an area of your classroom wall and you designate that as the challenge wall. And then what you do is maybe you as just as the teacher, or you with your students, come up with a whole series of really challenging questions and activities and tasks which you put on that wall. And then, whenever a learner has finished the main piece of work, you invite them to get up out of their desk, to go to the challenge wall and pick a challenge that they want to take on, whether that's a question or a task. I think the reason why this is really nice is twofold, really. First of all, you're making sending a very clear message to the class that actually challenge is something that we're all aiming for. And the second thing is you're introducing that element of fun, because you're saying, okay, you get the main bit of work completed, you do it successfully. It's then up to you to go and pick that challenge out and to embrace it and to see where it takes you. And one way you can then develop that is when students do sort of embrace the challenges and produce work, you can invite them to put their answers up on the challenge wall. So it becomes a combination of sort of the challenges and the responses to the challenges. And over time, it just very much creates a new normal in your classroom, which says challenges for everybody, challenge is fun, challenge is an essential part of what we do as learners when we're in the classroom and when we're learning.
Great. If there are no further questions, we will conclude the webinar for today. Thank you to all of you who attended, and a huge thanks to you, Mike, for your time today. With that, I will ask all of you to watch your email for more information on growth mindsets and a coupon code for his new book, How to Develop Growth Mindsets in the Classroom, which is filled with strategies and techniques that you can start implementing in your classroom right away. With that, we hope you have a wonderful day, and have a wonderful day to you too, Mike. Thanks again.
Thanks so much. All the best to everybody as well. Thank you.